Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Okayest Trapper Podcast. We are brought to you by Mountain Tough Fitness, Blokes, Modern Men's Health, and Trapline Beard Oil. Do me a favor, go check out the links to their products in the show notes. Use the promo codes for some great discounts and help support these great companies that are helping to keep our show on the digital airwaves. Now, today, my guest is a man who in the trapping world needs no introduction. He and his family have been in the fur and trap business for close to 100 years. That's a century for those who are keeping track, and he has generationally helped carry the family torch. He's a multifaceted and humble guy, and one that was willing to come on my little podcast. The owner of Duke Traps, Bill Duke, welcome to the show.
Hey, Zach, thanks so much for having me and taking the time out. I enjoy doing this stuff, and I think the more we do it, the easier it gets. And, you know, we all get to meet each other. It's such a small group that are trappers, and we all really need to work together and get to know each other better too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, when you start to go to all the different shows, whether it's NTA, FTA, and then all the regional and state, you know, rendezvous, you start to meet some of the same characters, especially the ones who are very active, you know, nationwide, which is a good thing. So again, I appreciate you hopping on with us.
Yeah, glad to do that. You're based out of Idaho, is that right?
That is. I am based out of the tiny little town of Atlanta, Idaho. Ironically, was born in Atlanta, Georgia, landed in Atlanta, Idaho, ultimately. So it was a full circle experience for me.
Yeah.
And you're based in Mississippi, correct?
We're based in West Point, Mississippi. It's a small town of about 10,000 in the northeast part of the state.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful area. I was talking before we hopped on that I used to live in a little southwest of you, I guess, there in Geismar, Louisiana. But I've got some friends that have been doing a lot of work in Mississippi. I've had the Mississippi Trap Queens from Beaver Unlimited on the show too, and talked a little bit about some of the ADC work they're doing in Mississippi. So, you know, we got a lot of ties to the Southeast, which is a beautiful thing. But Bill, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you the same question that I ask every guest to kind of get things kicked off, which is, if you could reach back in the deep recesses of your brain, and can you recount the first core memory you ever have of being exposed to trapping?
Well, when I was growing up in the business with my father and my grandparents, I was around trappers a lot. I mean, my grandparents and my dad bought fur going back a long way. And I guess just from a small child being around the office, and we were, you know, exposed to trappers coming in there. Of course, we sold trapping supplies too, so that was like my life.
And that was all based out of Mississippi from the beginning, or did they kind of move around a little bit?
No, we've always been based out of Mississippi. My grandparents, they started in a real humble way. They bought pecans and fur in the back of a little grocery market that they operated around town. And it was a sideline. It was just like whatever they could buy and sell to make a little extra change from the other things they were doing in the store. And the pecan business is one of the things that got us going. And then the trapping was an add-on to it with the fur buying. So my grandparents, that was just a little add-on that took over and became a bigger part of what they did.
That's beautiful. So I had a question tucked away for a little bit later, because as we were going back and forth, I happened to notice that, you know, your email address was Duke Pecan.
Yeah.
So is that still also a very alive and thriving part of the business as well?
It's a traditional part of our business. It's not as big as a trapping supply business we do. That's much larger.
Well, first and foremost, I don't think I would have ever had, and your grandparents probably didn't either, of, you know, pecan and fur as part of their like life bingo cards. But, you know, with that said, like, at what point in that history, right? So like, if I remember correctly from a little bit of the research I did, your grandparents started to come up with some of the fur in the 1930s. Is that right?
Yeah, I think just in a small way, they bought a little fur out of the back of their store and bought pecans too. It was really just a side hustle they did, and then there was a boom time period in the fur business that was like the 1970s and 1980s. That was a really big time. So the fur business got large for them, and then we still do that, but it's a much smaller part of.
Well, I'm curious, history is just such a big part of my life, and I've always enjoyed, especially becoming a trapper, learning more about the history. But, the 1930s too were a pretty big, not a boom, not quite like the 70s and 80s, but it was a healthy fur buying market. But in Mississippi, like, were you cultivating furs from all over the US? And I'm curious, like, what was the main purpose of purchasing and reselling fur? Was it a garment industry driving it? Was it, just coonskin hats? Like, what was the driver for the beginning? Obviously, there was a market for it, but what was the driver for your grandparents getting in other than just money?
Yeah, I think it was just a side hustle, and that was what they did for a little while. Of course, the fur market, it was a garment type business, selling raw skins into the fur garment business. But the big time was the 70s and 80s. That was the real big time. We hear stories about trappers that were making more money trapping than they did working a full-time job. So it was at least nice to live part of that history. It's not that way anymore, but people find a way to enjoy the passion, whether they're doing nuisance control work, working for other people doing that type work. And there are trappers out there that are making money in the fur market too.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So you were a kid during the fur boom, then, I assume, or like in the 70s and 80s. What was that like growing up then in essentially a trapping family? Like, I can only imagine, like, as the fur prices started to go up, and obviously you were doing trap manufacturing then at that point, I would imagine. And like, what was the air just growing up with that being like the environment?
Well, it was a fast-paced environment. You had fur routes that were going all over Mississippi and Alabama, parts of Florida too, and coordinating all that. It was there was a lot going on. It was early and late working all the time. I remember my dad. He was it would be nothing for him to drive across the country without sleeping, and to deliver a load of fur to dealers, and then make it back and start again the next week.
That's pretty amazing, and amazing just from the drive. It's funny, even with the fur boom, that's one thing I always harp on is trapping fur. No matter what, it is a second full-time job, and I can only imagine when the fur boom was going on that was probably tenfold. I imagine those few years or decade just wasn't a lot of sleep going on in the Duke household.
Well, I do remember it was just a lot of work. It was a lot of work, early getting up and then staying up late. A lot of nights my dad didn't get back till after 10 at night. But there were other people in the fur business that were doing the same thing. I know of Ludi Shetta's operation. People said that was a 24-hour fur buying operation in Iowa. So it was a time to live through, and glad I had the opportunity to be a part of it.
And as that, growing up in that too, did you actually get a chance to get out and trap much on your own in that time frame, or was it just pure business, pure really running 100 miles an hour and talking to other people selling furs, everything else going on in that space?
Oh no! When I was in high school, a group of my friends and I, we did put out a small trap line at that time. We were still young, and but in Mississippi at the time, we got our driver's licenses at 15, so we could drive, do whatever we wanted to do.
So you were part of that guild that was like before high school, before classes started, going out and checking your line, going to class and doing it afterwards as well?
Oh yeah, in the dark.
I got to ask, I lifeguarded in high school. It did not pay that well. As a young high school student during the fur boom who was actually running a small line, can you remember Did you make any silly or egregious purchases with any of the money you made off of your trap line when you were in high school?
If it was anything, it wasn't anything significant. I mean, we might have gone to McDonald's and gotten something to eat. It was we didn't really have a big line that we would have generated any income from. It was just a hobby.
Hey, but at the end of the day, though, that free McDonald's meal probably tasted a lot sweeter knowing that it was coming out of off the trap line.
Yeah, it was a fun time to do that.
And just purely curious too. So fur buying for the large part of many decades, at what point and how did your family start to, I don't know if it's expand or deviate towards actual trap production?
Right. So a little bit about our fur buying operation. We were also dealers in trapping supplies. We were a distributor for Northwoods traps, and Woodstream at the time made the Victor traps. So we were a Victor dealer as well. And my dad was doing a little business in Korea, developing some tools for nutcrackers, and he just off the idea, he said maybe he would try to develop a trap. So we came up with a 1.5 coil spring, and I believe that was sold in the fall of '86. So that would have been our first year in the trap business.
Now, was your dad a metal fabricator by trade?
No, not at all, not at all. He was looking for some tools that we could sell in our pecan business, and that led him to that.
That's pretty cool. Do you remember what that first 1.5 coil spring looked like? Did it look pretty good? Like what, I always imagine like entrepreneurs and, like that first prototype, you think it's pretty good at the time, but then you look back, 10, 20 years later after you guys have done everything that you have and you're like, whoa, we really started at the bottom and then worked our way up. But do you remember what that looked like at all?
Oh yeah, we still retain one model of that original production. It was a little on the light side. It was very close compared in style to a Victor 1.5, but a round jaw style trap that was adequate. But every year we stayed in the business. We improved upon it a little bit more because you have to.
Mm-hmm. And what was the kind of initial reception, right? You were a Victor dealer, and then all of a sudden you've got, did it always start with the family name? It was like, hey, this is a Duke trap. Or did that evolve as it went too? Or was it just like giving it to trappers you knew, be like, hey, just give this a whirl, see how it works for you? What was that like?
Well, I think the first year that one in '86, it just said Duke Fur Company on the pan. It was not well planned out. It was just like an offshoot idea to try. And then the years after that, we didn't have really any name we wanted to call it other than, what we operated by, which was Duke. So we just called it Duke Trap.
And then, you guys are in Mississippi.
Yeah.
You might be dealing with coon, fox, maybe coyotes. Like, you guys have expanded so much since 1986, from water trapping to footholds. What was the process like for developing new traps for trappers? Was it just purely based on the demand from the trapping community, or did you guys kind of look ahead a little bit and be like, hey, for something like for bobcats or some bigger game trapping out west, we need to develop this style of trap? Like, how did that process really evolve 86 on?
Well, from '86. Thinking about the cycle of the fur trade, it has always operated in cycles, and '86 was close to the peak. It was close to the peak. I remember '87 things started getting a little bit stronger, but then '88, '89, '90, those were some really, really weak years, and I think our idea was, you're not going to make it in a trap deal if you only have one item. If you've got a 1.5 coil, heck, everybody's got a 1.5 coil. So we just decided to expand it on. So we had at least a presentable group of traps that somebody could choose from. There were a lot of coon trappers for sure. There were fox and coyote trappers. There were the body gripping traps. Those were not as, I mean, they existed, but they weren't in as large a use as they are now. But we had to have all that if we wanted to be relevant. So that's why we continued to develop new traps, and we do that still today because there's always something that's going to be an improvement. Whether you improve an existing model or whether you take a new concept trap like the DP, that has just been a complete game changer for so many trappers.
Yeah, and then one of the questions I had, and it kind of goes to that, is clearly you're at shows, you're going around, you're getting to meet so many people, whether that's digitally through podcasts, but what's kind of the main modification that you see trappers making to traps today? And I'm assuming that might even lead to some innovation that you guys kind of come up with over the years.
I've got to think on that because nothing comes to mind immediately for modifications. Different trappers do different things. But
whether I think cutting down the pan size and pan tension and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, people are doing some of that. They are getting a little bit more technical about pan tension. For a standard 1.5 coil trap, what a lot of people are going to do is night latch it right out of the box, so they have that very, very crisp pull on that pan when it's set.
And for those, again, this podcast is often geared towards newer trappers. So night latching, could you explain that a little bit, just for those who might not understand what that is?
Yeah, sure. You take a metal file and you file across the pan notch, and make the pan notch just a little bit shorter, and then you file an internal groove. So when that pan pulls down, you're going to hear an audible click. People have done videos on how to do that. It's a little bit of a fine art, but it sure makes the trap function a lot easier.
And that's also a good way to know, like, you've got your pan right where you want it. When you hear that click, you're good to go, and then you can make your set.
Yeah, you're not having to worry about pan creep, which is something a lot of people do worry about. If that animal steps on something and it gives, that coyote may be out of there. So making sure when that pan first drops, it's going to fire very, very crisp.
Yeah, and then like with your family being so involved from the business perspective, I did a little research too, and I know Duke traps are often at the top for AFWA. So for those listening, Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and the whole best management practices, having traps that are essentially certified as ethical and really good at what they do in a great way. And Duke Trap seems to be at the top of that in a lot of regards. Was that a relationship that has just become organic, where those traps have kind of bubbled up to the top, or have you guys worked with AFWA in the past? How did that come about?
I'm not real sure that I know what list you're looking at. I know the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies did some work on the BMP process, and they made a list of recommended styles of traps that trappers could reasonably expect to get the best results out of.
Yep.
And some of those first ones they tested are no longer available anymore, and so I guess maybe by just nothing, those main ones not being available, they maybe elevated ours up in the list. I have no idea otherwise.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's great, as the point is like that. The traps you are producing are making these lists of ethical, well-designed, functioning styles of traps. And when you go to shows, like, how does it feel when you talk to trappers who've leveraged traps that you've manufactured to, catch critters for years, or even sometimes decades? I can imagine the stories are pretty amazing when you get to connect with those folks.
Well, they generally are happy to see you when you go to a show. When they've had good results with your product, they're happy to tell you about it. Of course, if they've got any complaints, they'll tell you about that too.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Could you think of any of those offhand? Maybe an example of both, of like an example of somebody being like, wow, this really worked out in my favor and I'm a Duke fan for life. And then maybe one where it was a, less than stellar, but maybe there was a, whether it was trapper error or, trap error, I don't know.
Well, I think the beginner trappers, they're the most excited to talk about their successes. And if they've gotten out there and trapped their first coon or their first coyote, they're feeling pretty good about that. And they always like to tell you about that experience and show you pictures, which I'm always happy to see. And you know that they're enjoying what they do. It makes you feel good to know that you're at least participating in that experience they're having.
Yeah, well, first I have to be upfront. The first fox I ever caught was with a Duke trap, and I'm not sure if it's the marketing or just your presence in the industry, but for new trappers, when you look up traps and what to buy, like there's a few prominent brands, and Duke is obviously one of those at the top, and that's just kind of the way that cookie fell or crumbled for me. I was like, oh well, here's some Duke traps. I'm going to buy Duke traps, and that's what I'm going to get started with. So it was kind of an honor for me to sit and chat with you too, because that was really where I got my start. And obviously, I've dabbled in a bunch of different trap styles now and trap manufacturers, just because I think that's the way it goes. But I was satisfied with that, and I think you guys have a pretty good handle on a lot of the new trapper market too, which is pretty awesome.
Having a variety of traps for people to choose their particular circumstances. For example, you're into coons, you got a choice of a trap that is very, very basic in a 1.5 coil. And anybody can learn a lot by just taking that simple trap out. They can catch foxes with it. They can catch coon with it. It's just one of the more versatile traps anybody could ever be successful with. And then we get into a little bit more advanced traps, the ones that we're selling into the more professional area, like those Pro Series, starting with the 550 offset, then the 650 offset, the 850s. We're just trying to expand into areas where we've got an appeal to every aspect of the trapper, whether you're a beginner trapper on a tight budget or you're a more advanced trapper and you're looking for some very high quality equipment. We've got something to cover all those bases.
Yeah, and the 850s from a wolf trapping perspective, I'm pretty excited about that. And
that trap was so interesting to develop.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that, because again, like there's a wolf skull back there, and that's kind of where I've started to cut my teeth. So I'd love to hear about how that all came about.
Yeah, so when we first started looking at coming up with a trap that would be suitable for wolves, we looked at what was available already. And there's some really good stuff out there. And then there's some stuff that was developed for beavers that people adapted for wolves that, have some deficiencies in it. And I really didn't know a lot about wolf trapping because we don't have wolves here. It's not something I've been exposed to, but when you really get down to it, wolves are very intelligent and they are very strong, and they'll find any weakness in a trap that exists. So one of my good friends, Dan Urich, he is a good friend from western part of Colorado. Dan and I started talking a little bit about what makes a really good wolf trap, and we started developing a prototype. And I sent it to Dan, and he says, "Well, you really need to have a high lever lockup. Look at the angle of the lever lockup. That's so critical, and it is that is so true." So we had to increase the lever lockup angle. And
real quick, again, I want to do this as a benefit for newer trappers. The lever lockup, like when you think about the trap and the jaws that are closing, can you explain a little bit about what that is and what that adjustment actually look like?
Yeah, sure. So I have a trap here. This is a 650. You can see the lever lockup angle. This is what I'm referring to. If this trap had a lever lockup that ended about right here, you would have a greater likelihood that the animal that was caught might be able to leverage out of that trap. So the higher the lever lockup, it makes it virtually impossible for the animal to leverage out of the trap. So that's what we focused on. And more than anybody, Dan just made that point. He said, you got to get a high lever lockup on these wolf traps, because they will leverage out of them if it's, a low lever lockup. So we came up with a prototype on that. And the spring pin was a little bit light. And he says, you know what a wolf's going to do? They're going to take that and they're going to crunch it with their teeth.
Yep.
And so we made it stronger. We made it out of thicker material. And I think we ended up having 3 prototype revisions until we were really satisfied with it. But that's the critical thing, is being satisfied that it's going to do the job. And when Dan gave me the sign of approval, I knew we had something good there.
That's pretty awesome. And how long has that been on the market for now? And have you gotten any kind of I haven't had the opportunity to use an 850 to catch a wolf yet. It's on my list for this winter, hopefully, fingers crossed. But have you heard or gotten any feedback from the field, especially from folks out here in Montana, Idaho, where we have a pretty big push?
Oh yeah, we're getting continual feedback from trappers that are using those and having success with it. It all starts as that trap is a real heavy trap. The guys up that were real early on using it were in Ketchikan, around Ketchikan, Alaska, on an island of Prince of Wales Island. They just got an idea. Hey, we're looking for something that's just a little bit bigger, something a little bit higher lever lockup and stronger. And on a chance, they tried some of these out, and the results they gave to us were that it was jumping up through frozen precipitation. I mean, just all types of conditions. They have snow, freeze, thaw, and it was jumping up through that and having perfect pad catches. So they were basically sold on it at that time, and I thought we had something good when we were seeing some of those catch photos, and I think it's only grown to be more and more positive with that trap.
That's awesome. And then what else is kind of on the horizon as it relates to kind of new, I don't know if you want to say inventions, but new modifications, new traps? Is there anything else that's kind of on the horizon similar to like the 850, where it was a new venture for you guys and seeing a lot of success?
Well, I'll talk just a little bit about what we came out with this year. That was the 450 closed jaw version and the offset version. And that trap has a big following in the East. Mm-hmm. Fox trappers, they like a 450 because it's easier on the animals. And even the live market coyote and fox trappers, they're looking at that trap as an easier trap that's going to, not cause foot damage, because they don't want to do that. They can't sell their animals if they're, if they have foot damage. So we came out with that this past summer. Really surprised at the amount of interest in it. And you talked about what would be mistakes we made. Probably one of the bigger mistakes I made was just not listening to trappers tell me that, hey, we need a 450. I just didn't think there was a need for it for a long time. I thought maybe a 550 would cover all the needs. And I had trappers coming up to me at shows, and they would say, hey, when are you going to come out with a 450? I really like that design. You need something that's going to be a little more easier on the foxes. And I just put it off and didn't really act on it. And then we finally did, and we sold heaps of them. It's become a very good seller for us.
That's awesome. Yeah, sometimes you got to learn the hard way. You listen to customers, you push it off, and then when you do, you're like, oh, why did I not do that earlier?
I know, that's the way I felt. Why didn't I listen to these guys a long time ago? Because we would have had it out years ago if I had. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, regular jaws, offset jaws. As a trap manufacturer, you're dealing with 50 states and international. And, for those who are listening who might be newer, offset jaws, there's essentially a spacing. I don't know if you have one handy sitting on your desk, but
I've got this 650, and you can see the offset jaw through here. It's not quite a quarter of an inch, but it's a gap space, and the gap space does allow those levers to come up quite a bit higher than if they were just a full jaw, where that lever would be a little bit lower.
And with that too, like in a lot of states, from a regulation standpoint, might determine what types of traps you can and cannot use. So from a trap manufacturer's perspective, like, are you just having to look across all 50 states, kind of find the lowest common denominators and say, well, we need to be able to do the 450s and an offset, 450s regular, and then cater to everybody? How does that work when you have so many different competing, needs state to state?
Well, you know as well as I, every state is different, and you'll never please every state regulation, but you try to have a workable solution that a trapper can buy any of your traps and make it work. I mean, jaw spread in some areas is a limitation. They may have a limitation of 6.5 inches jaw spread, so you're limited that way. But at least we've got options all the way around, from a 450. Even as small as a number 1 and 0 long spring, those small sizes all the way up to an 850, most of them having offset variations that would either cater to the trapper or would meet the requirements for the regulation in the state. But I'm no source on all the state regulations. I know some of them basically, but to be familiar with every single state's regulation, gosh, you would really, really have to study that stuff and know what you're doing.
Yeah, you'd have to be a literal walking encyclopedia, because it's impressive how much we are regulated, which is an interesting thing too. I think a lot of people have that misnomer of trapping being kind of a throw something on the ground, see what happens, but we are by far probably the most regulated recreational activity out there, in my opinion, which definitely rolls over into your business too, I'm sure.
Well, some states are more regulated than others. It just depends on where somebody resides and where they trap. Where I am, we have fairly easy regulations for most fur bearers. You do have to still get your otters and bobcats tagged, but that's one of the bigger regs.
Yeah. And speaking of, so like otters, bobcats with the CITES tag, right? The international trade. I caught an otter with my daughter 2 weeks ago. Same thing. Had to go to Idaho Fish and Game, get it tagged, and all of that. But I think I've had 2 guests on who were international, right? One was from Australia, the other's from Canada. I'm curious, with being a trap manufacturer, I'm always interested, especially when you look worldwide. Like the US, like we have a pretty healthy trapping culture nationwide, I think. Obviously we're, growing and trying to preserve it. But worldwide, like what does that look like? I mean, are you guys sending traps to other countries? Are there other countries who are purchasing traps? And if so, which ones? Because I'm just curious, like there has to be other countries out there who still have, a trapping culture as well.
There are. We've shipped traps to all continents except Antarctica. There are no mammals down there, but anyway, we've shipped traps to lots of countries in Europe. And Australia, New Zealand. I think Australia, that's a little bit bigger as far as the international markets for trapping goes. They've got a lot of animals down there that need to be controlled.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the international markets more depend on control mechanisms. Their population of invasive species that have gotten out of control. Predators certainly, and the people need a method for controlling it. One of the more interesting ones, I think, is Japan. Japan has a population of North American raccoon that live there.
That's pretty interesting. And was that an import then by accident, or how did that work out? And then what is the play with obviously Duke traps and maybe some DPs and other things that are making their way over there to help with that population control?
Yeah, the Japan population of raccoons was, I believe, brought over as a pet project. People like pets, and they're real, attracted to dogs and cats. And the way it was told to me was there was a Japanese cartoon that was a raccoon character, and people thought, wow, raccoons are really cute, and why don't we bring some in here as pets? And so they brought them in as pets, and then they were nice for a while, and then they weren't, and they released them. And that northernmost island of Hokkaido has one of the bigger populations of North American raccoon. So they're obviously looking for a solution.
And so they started importing away. Was it mostly DPs? Was it footholds? And I guess like from a regulation standpoint in Japan, like were they hiring trappers? Were there trappers that had experience in Japan? I can imagine maybe not, but who knows?
I don't think there were any trappers with experience. I think more than anything, it would have been a control mechanism. Maybe the farmers have raccoons coming around, so they set some of these traps out and try to catch them and keep the population down.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
I read something last week about the bear problem also in Japan. Similarly, like there's no active hunting or like open hunting seasons around black bears, and the number of black bear human encounters has skyrocketed. And it's interesting because Japan is so unique in that they really like exotic foods. And I read somewhere that like they are starting to do some control of black bears, and there's some places where you can buy black bear meat now from the control projects in vending machines.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, I've not heard that story before, but it wouldn't surprise me. They're innovators in a lot of ways there.
Yeah, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, the fact that Japan is having that problem and then you're helping them with a solution, that's a pretty cool, real full circle experience. With the trapping community, like, we talked a little bit before, like, facing pressure from anti-trapping hunting organizations. We obviously had the big win in Colorado last week or 2 weeks ago during the election. Dan Gates did a great job driving that forward to help get that squashed with the mountain lion and bobcat deal there. But like from a trap manufacturer's point of view, I mean, you have to be tuned in to everything going on, right? Is there anything that, is special from your point of view as we as trappers work through how we preserve this activity, whether it's for business or recreation? And then ultimately, like, what do you think we need to be doing as trappers to make sure we're putting ourselves out there in the best light possible?
Well, I think being a responsible trapper, following the regulations, don't do things that are against the regulations. And that really helps our image in the eyes of other outdoor sporting public members. I can remember when I was younger, trappers were kind of a faction of their own. They really didn't interact with a lot of other outdoor people, and probably the other outdoor people, whether they be duck hunters or turkey or deer hunters, regarded trappers as outlaws, I'm sure. But our reputation has improved over time because people are doing the right thing, and you can feel good about that. And the one thing I really like that I see now is the close cooperation between trappers associations and those other associations, whether they be deer, turkey, pheasant hunters. They all see the benefit of trapping, and that's really our strength. The strength is in the numbers. If somebody wants to pick on trapping, it's not that low-hanging fruit that they can take off and just discard us like rubbish. We've got other people that are going to stand up for the rights to trap and say, hey, we need this equipment. We need this to be available. And those safety, that's just safety in numbers. I'm really pleased to see that now more than ever. And like you mentioned, Dan, with the effort he had in Colorado, he's had his back against the wall lots and lots of times. He knows what it's like. And I'm real happy that the organization prevailed in that.
Yeah, that's a guy you want in your corner. He's been on this podcast. He invited me down to go to their Pioneer Days when they had a bunch of people doing out. I did a little demo. It was a lot of fun. But man, you talk about effort, and I'm glad to see it, because I feel like that was a tide turning moment, because we got a lot of black eyes before that, right? New Mexico was a big example. I've had the New Mexico Trappers Association president on, and like hearing their stories of fighting hard, but not having necessarily all the backing or having somebody there to push as hard. And then all of a sudden you lose all of public land trapping. And, Oregon's gone the same way. And there's so many different states that were kind of look like dominoes were falling. And then Colorado was that bastion. And I think a lot of people really rallied around that and really saw the need. And I was nervous going into that, even though I'm in Idaho, but you just didn't want another domino to fall, and thankfully it didn't. And I think that's a testament of what you're saying.
Yeah, we're seeing some real positive developments in that area. I think people have just had enough of the overreach of these people that they maybe think that they're well-meaning, but I mean, they're basically trying to tell somebody how to live their lives, and they just need to mind their own business.
Yeah, and one thing with this show has become extremely apparent to me. The best trappers who are putting up tons of fur to the new trapper, every single person I have talked to, and I'm pretty good at reading people, genuinely loves any of the critters that they're pursuing. And it's a very hard thing for people who might not be a trapper or a hunter or something to wrap your minds around. But the people who are pursuing these animals have the utmost respect for them. They really care for the animal and have, a genuine, almost love affair with them, but it's still a target of theirs. And that's a hard thing for many, I think, anti-trappers, anti-hunters to wrap their mind around. But the truth is that's fact. They do.
There's a fundamental lack of understanding from people that live on the coast, that never spent much time in the outdoors. There's a lack of understanding like that. I've got a good friend that lives in the area of San Francisco, and he told me one time, I just don't see the need for people to own guns. And I said, well, it's part of our culture in this country, and you may not need it where you are, but there are a lot of people that value that right, and that's their lifestyle. I think people just need to respect other people's lifestyles. If that's what they like to do, as long as they're not bothering anybody else and not violating laws, I think people should be allowed to do that. I think we're going to see some big improvements in that with the turnover of the administration too.
Yeah, I think so too, and I'm hopeful with that as well. But you're right; it is an interesting thing, like where my last career saw me, going, despite being relatively rural, growing up rural, though I wasn't trapping and hunting. I was very much in the 2A community, and I almost felt whenever I had to go to San Francisco or New York or wherever, I needed that more than I would back home. So it's interesting when you talk to people who are so, I guess, not desensitized, but are used to just the chaos of the city. And like, you don't need that. You don't need those things. And, it's a hard thing for them to grasp, and especially when you get to something like trapping.
Yeah, I mean, it's real easy for somebody to tell another person how they can live their life, and if you come up in an area like those coastal areas, the east or the west coast, you may think that that's okay, but people really don't like to be told how to live their lives.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is, our education. Like, despite growing up in a pseudo rural area, the education I was brought up on in the 80s and 90s was a push away from having any self-reliance, right? It was, you need to go to college or bust, whether it be trades and self-reliance, that's for the birds. Don't do that. Focus on doing your SATs and go to school, pay the debt. And I think that's prolific across our country now. And it's scary to see that we have so many people that are reliant on those systems now. So, talk to whether it's coastal people or even some of the big cities in the South, Nashville or Atlanta, Georgia. People are used to going and hunting at the grocery store, right? They're going to go, the stocks or the shelves are going to be stocked. They're provided for, like, don't worry about that. And we've lost touch clearly with like the real, how do you trap or withhold an animal that you could either release or use for food, for turning into clothing, for warmth, whatever it is. Like, that is so far removed for most people. But even just the hunting for sustenance is a pretty foreign concept for the majority of people. And that was an eye opener for me, but it's scary when you look at it in aggregate across our country.
Oh yeah, there's just a fundamental lack of understanding how the other parts of the world live and what makes them tick.
Yeah. But if you had your crystal ball, if you were shaking your little magic 8-ball, what do you see as the future of trapping?
I think what we're going to see is better traps that are easier on the animals. We've already gotten into some of those with our Pro Series traps that have smooth, rounded jaw facings. I think for foot traps, that's going to be the future. And with respect to the body gripping traps, the new ones that we're working on now that we call the Super Mags, that have very tight, very tight jaw closure, I think that's going to be the future of the body trap world. People are going to see the benefits of it. They're going to see that it's a very quick kill time. They're going to see that animal, when it gets caught, doesn't even move. There's just so much better outcomes when the animal is not in a trap for very long before it expires. And even if it is a foot trap, that animal could be in that trap for quite a while, and the smoothness of the jaw doesn't cut into the foot. It's more like a light handcuff that just merely holds that animal there until the trapper gets there. And that's what we'd like to see. When I think about the Pro Series traps we have now, it's the best of both worlds. It's a win for the animal because the animal is not really suffering in that trap. It's easy on that animal. It's also a trap that's very well laid out, very precise, and the trappers like it. Usually there's a side to it that one is not as good as the other, but it's almost as good of a win-win as you could find for the animal and for the user of that trap.
And I guess another nod too, one that I think about a lot. I have young kids, but what's also cool about what you're creating, obviously all of those things you just said, but you're also creating heirloom products. Like, I like to think about my kid or my grandkid one day going through and rummaging through a box or up at our cabin and, seeing an old 850 that grandpa used to catch X number of wolves, et cetera, which, I don't think there's many products, not even in the trapping world, but just writ large today, that can last generations. And then, 2 generations from now, my grandkid could pop that up, boil it, re-dye it, and use it.
Oh yeah. They're doing it all the time. The old Newhouse long spring traps that maybe their granddad was using, they're still around.
And that's pretty dang cool. Now, as we kind of come up to the close, Bill, I usually go through a little bit of a lightning round of questions, but as a gentleman who's spent a lot of time out in the woods, who's talk to a lot of people out in the woods. What is your wildest experience that you've ever had in the woods?
Gosh. Zach, I started hunting a little bit later in life just by my friends pushing me to get out there a little bit more. And yeah, the past couple of years have really been the highlight of it. I never shot a deer until 2 years ago.
Wow, that's awesome.
And so, that was a big experience for me. I'd been around people that had hunted all their lives, but we don't have a lot of rural land, at least in our family. So, I'd have to depend on people that did have it. And so one of my friends, he says to me, you really hadn't killed a deer. You really need to get out here. Come out on my place, and I'll set you up. And I never realized how addictive that would be, and how much it messes with your head when you miss a shot. Oh, I couldn't sleep.
Yeah,
And
it's
stuff like that. It was a great experience, but I never had that feeling before that so much regret when you miss a shot. It happens. I mean, it happens, and I don't want it to happen anymore. But
it will, though. That's the unfortunate thing. It will, but that's awesome. Do you remember the feeling when you shot your first deer? Was it a doe or a buck?
Oh, it was a small buck.
Yeah. Regardless, button, buck, whatever. What was that feeling when you walked up to it and you were able to lay hands on it for the first time?
Well, it was a little bit different than walking up on it because we never found it for the longest time. And so my buddy Blake calls me on the phone about a month after we never could find it. Knew that we had it, but just could not find it. And he was stumbling around the area where we were hunting, and he ends up finding the antlers and the skull. And so he calls me up and he says, "What are you doing?" He says, I got something I want to bring you." So he shows up and he has that. And I mean, that was just the biggest delight to see that. I mean, I thought I was never going to find it.
Yeah,
that's
part of the game. This past couple weeks ago, a buddy of mine went mule deer hunting out in here in Idaho in the backcountry, and hiking in a couple miles in, we bumped some does and really early rutting activity, but a little 3x3 was just kind of pushing these does, and buddy took a shot and kind of watched it walk over the ridge. He was hit, and we went up to where it happened after giving the deer some time and couldn't find any blood. No blood, like anywhere. The does had all kind of hung around, and we watched them walk off. We didn't see the buck come back by, so we knew he was hit. Same story. It took us forever. We spent like 6 hours just trying to find it. And we were sitting there eating lunch, 6-7 hours after the shot, and we were just kind of snooping around where we thought he was going, and we found the tiniest drop of blood on a leaf. And that sent us on this like path where like I turned into a hound dog. I was on my hands and knees. We're looking at the pass through this buck brush. We followed this trail for 4 hours, and like I wish I had a happy ending. I don't, though, right? Like it just went, like it opened up this big open area, and it was gone. We ended up, I shot a buck later that night, which was great. So we kind of had some redemption, but it's heartbreaking, especially if you take a bad shot. But I'm really glad that your friend was able to actually find, at least the antlers and be able to bring that to you.
Oh yeah, that just made my day. It was a great feeling to see that, because I thought I would never find it. Yeah.
And have you been able to get out since then too?
Well, that was a couple of years ago, and then we started doing a little turkey hunting too. The turkeys in this area are a little bit more elusive than they are in other parts of the country.
Yeah, that's what I tell myself too. It's the turkeys, it's not me.
Yeah.
All right. And then, I always kind of end on a hypothetical. So would you rather be able to continue manufacturing traps for trappers for the rest of your life, but you can't deer hunt anymore? Or would you be able to rather be able to hunt any big game animal forever, But I got this all buggered in my head. So you can continue to produce traps for trappers, but you can't deer hunt. Or the opposite of that, which would be that you can continue to hunt big game animals. I'll extend that to elk, everything else, but you can't, and you stop your trap manufacturing.
Oh, I think I'd have to keep the trap deal. I would, I enjoy all that. I'd like to do it all because every experience we have in life is just adds up. But coming from a family that's got a long background in trapping, I think I like to do this as long as it's viable.
That's pretty amazing. And I guess, the question, where does it go after you? Are the kids going to take it on, or is that all up in the air? And
well, I'm not that old, and I don't have any children, but so I mean, I guess I continue on for as long as as long as I can.
Well, that's pretty awesome. I mean, it's a beautiful legacy. I'm excited and happy that I got my first critter with a Duke trap, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate the time you took to take and talk with me, and I know a lot of new trappers are going to be excited to hear everything you had to say. So kind of with parting thoughts, I have one more question, and then just kind of would love to hear where people can learn more and where they can find out more about Duke traps. But for new trappers, if you had to give them 3 traps they could pick up from your lineup to get them started, what would those be?
New traps, just starting out, I would say a 1.5 coil spring trap. I would say a DP, and depending on where somebody is in the country, if they have a lot of water, if they are in the desert, it's obviously not going to be ideal. But a 110 body trap, those are easy traps to play around with and be successful with if you've got the animals to trap.
Perfect.
And then grow from there into bigger sizes.
Love it. I think that's great advice. And where can people find out more about you, Bill? I know you guys are becoming more active on Instagram, and anywhere else they can learn.
Yep. Recently, we've got a little more active Facebook presence, Instagram too. Our website is duketraps.com. We when people call or email us and are looking for advice, I tell them one of the best ways to learn about trapping is just to start watching YouTube videos because you're going to learn. You could watch videos on trapping all day long and you wouldn't exhaust it. Whatever you're into, whatever species you're into, you can learn about it from that. And that's something the older trappers never had a resource. They had to depend on somebody to tell them how to trap. And the closely guarded secrets they didn't get. But now you've got a lot of internet channel operators that have good information out there, steer you in the right direction with the right equipment. I mean, I just think the opportunities are so great now.
I am a pure testament to that. As I got started later in life, I was very fortunate to be part of the YouTube generation and have access to, especially in my first shed, skinning out my first critters with, somebody there helping me, guide me along the way as I screwed it up every way you could imagine. But the same with setting traps. So I think that's really great advice for people looking out. And there's a lot of great YouTube channels who are putting out really high quality content.
And in addition to that, the Trappers Associations, the National Trappers Association, the Fur Takers of America, all the state trapping associations have good trapper training classes. A lot of them do. And they're more than happy to help somebody that's just getting started with that extra education so they know what they're doing and don't make mistakes. So yeah, all these resources combined, I think it's never been this strong.
Yep. And we got to keep that ball rolling. But Bill, it's been a true honor. I appreciate it. And for everybody listening, we'll catch you on another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast.
Hey, Zach, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
Awesome.